The chapel at Halford Park smelled of beeswax and cold stone, and the woman standing at the altar had never seen the man walking toward her. Eleanor Graves held her gloved hands together at her waist and watched the Duke of Halford close the distance between the door and the communion rail in 12 measured strides, and in those 12 strides she tried to learn everything she could about the rest of her life. He was tall. His shoulders filled the coat without strain. His jaw was set in a line that suggested he had decided something before entering the room and did not intend to revisit it. He did not smile. He did not look at the pews, where his mother sat rigid as a pillar, and a woman in pale blue silk watched with an expression Eleanor could not yet read. He looked at Eleanor, and his gaze was the gaze of a man inspecting a document he had not drafted and did not intend to refuse. She felt her pulse climb into her throat and held very still, the way one holds still when the room is watching, and the room has already made its decision. The vicar opened the Book of Common Prayer. His hands were steady. Eleanor's were not. She could feel the thin cotton of her gloves against her knuckles, and the particular coolness of the chapel air against her collarbones, where the dress she had sewn herself sat slightly too wide. She had no veil. She had no flowers. She had a borrowed mantle over her shoulders, lent by the housekeeper that morning with a sympathetic press of the hand and no explanation. The Dowager Duchess had spoken to the vicar before the service. Eleanor had heard the words through the vestry door, low and precise, and meant to carry. "The contract bride," the Dowager had said to the woman in blue, her voice carrying the particular inflection of a woman naming a category rather than a person. The phrase had landed like a coin on a marble floor, ringing once, and then settling into the silence that followed it. Lady Phoebe Langton had tilted her chin and said nothing, and the nothing had been eloquent. If you have ever stood at the beginning of something you did not choose, and felt the weight of every eye in the room on the back of your neck, stay close. This story knows the feeling. The contract had been signed 14 years ago in a solicitor's office on Chancery Lane, and Eleanor had not been present. She had been 8 years old and sitting in her mother's garden in Hertfordshire, pulling weeds from around a rose bush that would outlast both her parents. Her father, Sir William Graves, had owed the late Duke of Halford a debt of £4,000, accumulated across a decade of quiet financial mismanagement and one disastrous investment in a shipping concern that sank, quite literally, off the coast of Portugal. The late Duke had proposed a settlement. Sir William's daughter, upon reaching her majority, or upon the death of the surviving parent, whichever came later, would be offered in marriage to the Duke's eldest son, Lord Sebastian Ashworth. The debt would be forgiven. The Graves estate would be released from its lien. Both fathers had signed. Both fathers were now dead. Eleanor's mother had died the previous winter, a Tuesday in February, sitting in the chair beside the hearth, with the book of verse still open on her lap and the fire still warm. Eleanor had found her in the morning and had known before she touched her hand, and she had sat beside her mother's body for an hour before she called for anyone, because the hour was the last hour in which she would be a daughter in a house and not a dependent in someone else's. It was her mother's solicitor, a Mr. Fellows with ink-stained fingers and a gentle voice, who had produced the contract from a locked drawer 3 weeks later and explained to Eleanor that her future had been settled before she learned to read. She had sat in his office on a Tuesday morning in September and listened to the terms, and when he finished, she had asked one question. "Does the Duke know?" Mr. Fellows had folded his hands on his desk, his thumbs pressed together. His Grace was informed upon his father's death 3 years ago. He has not contested the arrangement. She had nodded. She had not cried. She had returned to her aunt's house in Bath, where she had lived as a dependent for 2 years, sleeping in the room above the kitchen where the plaster was cracked and the northeast corner leaked when it rained. She mended Mrs. Thornberry's linens in exchange for a roof, and she took her meals in the kitchen rather than the dining room, and she wore her cousin's cast-off dresses with the hems taken up because her cousin was 3 inches taller. Her aunt had received the news of the contract with visible relief, the relief of a woman setting down a parcel she had never wanted to carry. "Well," Mrs. Thornberry had said, "at least something useful has come of your father's difficulties." Within a fortnight, Eleanor was in a hired carriage bound for Halford Park, with 1 trunk, 1 valise, and the small leather-bound book of verse her mother had kept on her bedside table. Inside the cover, pressed flat between the title page and the dedication, was a single dried violet, its color faded to the gray of old silk. Her mother had marked a passage near the back. The ink had bled slightly into the margin. And the words were these, in her mother's hand. Not the poet's. "Home is the room where someone expects you." Eleanor had read it on the carriage seat and closed the book and watched the hedgerows of Hertfordshire give way to the beech woods of Buckinghamshire, and the distance between her old life and her new one was measured in turning leaves and fading light, and the particular silence of a woman traveling toward a man she had never met. The wedding breakfast was held in the long gallery at Halford Park, and Eleanor sat at the head of the table beside a man who had spoken exactly 9 words to her, all of them during the ceremony, and all of them prescribed by the liturgy. She had watched his mouth form the words, "I will," and had searched his face for any sign that the words carried private weight. And she had found nothing. Only the same controlled stillness he had worn walking up the aisle. The guests numbered 30. She knew none of them. The Dowager Duchess sat at the far end and presided over the conversation with the ease of a woman who had managed this table for 30 years and did not intend to relinquish it to a girl from Hertfordshire whose father had been a debtor, and whose gown, Eleanor was quietly certain, was the plainest garment in the room. It was white muslin, simply cut, with no lace at the collar and no embroidery at the hem. She had sewn it herself in her aunt's sitting room from fabric purchased with the last of her quarterly allowance, working by the light of a single candle because the good lamps were in the parlor and the parlor was not hers to use in the evening. Beside the Dowager sat Lady Phoebe Langton, daughter of the Earl of Staverton, and Eleanor understood within the first quarter hour that Lady Phoebe had expected to be sitting where Eleanor sat. Lady Phoebe's posture said it. Her smile, directed at Sebastian with a familiarity that assumed history, said it. The angle of her fan, half open and resting on the table as though she might need it at any moment, said it. A gentleman 3 seats down leaned toward his neighbor and murmured something Eleanor caught in fragments. The contract bride, yes. £4,000, I am told. Imagine being purchased for the price of a modest house in Surrey. The neighbor's gaze traveled the length of the table and found Eleanor, and Eleanor looked at her plate and cut a piece of cold ham she did not intend to eat. The ham was pink and perfectly carved, resting on porcelain she could not have afforded in 3 years of mending linens, and the knife in her hand was heavier than any knife she had held before. Beside her, Sebastian's hand moved. He set his knife down with a precision that drew no attention, and said, without turning his head, "Eat something." His voice was low and level. It was the first thing he had said to her outside the liturgy, and it sounded like a command. She picked up her fork. Across the gallery, through the door that led to the nursery passage, a sound arrived that rearranged every calculation Eleanor had made on the carriage ride. A child was crying. The cry was not the wail of temper. It was the thin, bewildered sound of a small creature who had woken in a room and found it empty. No one at the table moved. The dowager continued speaking about the partridges at Lord Fenwick's estate. Lady Phoebe adjusted her fan. Sebastian's jaw tightened, and his hand pressed flat against the tablecloth, and he did not rise. Eleanor set her napkin beside her plate and stood. The room went quiet. 30 people watched her cross the gallery in her plain white muslin, and she felt every one of their gazes like a hand on her shoulder, and she did not slow. She walked to the nursery passage door, opened it, and followed the sound up a narrow staircase to a room papered in faded yellow, where a girl of perhaps 2 years sat in a small bed, with her fists pressed against her eyes. The room smelled of lavender and milk. A wooden horse lay on its side on the rug. Eleanor knelt beside the bed. "Hello," she said. "My name is Eleanor. I'm going to sit with you for a moment, if you will let me." The child lowered her fists. Her face was wet and blotched and utterly without pretense, and her eyes, which were the same gray as her father's, fixed on Eleanor with the frank assessment of a person who has not yet learned to hide what she is looking for. Eleanor reached into the pocket of her plain dress and produced a handkerchief, and she wiped the child's face with the same steady hands that had mended her aunt's linens and sewn her own wedding gown. And the child, whose name she would learn was Cecily, leaned forward and rested her head against Eleanor's shoulder and stopped crying. The weight of her was warm and solid, and trusting in a way that made Eleanor's throat close. She did not know that Sebastian had followed her to the foot of the stairs. She did not know that he stood in the passage with one hand on the banister and watched the woman he had married that morning kneel on the nursery floor and hold his daughter as though holding a child were the most ordinary thing in the world. She did not see his face. The audience did. The first weeks at Halford Park taught Eleanor the architecture of her displacement. She was the Duchess of Halford in name and in the marriage register at the parish church. The household did not treat her as such. The dowager held the keys to every storeroom and linen cupboard. The dowager approved the menus, selected the wines, arranged the flowers in the hall, and determined which fires were lit and at what hour they were banked. She dismissed and appointed the maids, and when Eleanor asked the housekeeper, Mrs. Croft, whether the linens in the east bedchamber might be aired, Mrs. Croft looked at her with an expression that contained sympathy and apology in equal measure, and said, "I shall ask Her Grace." Her Grace was not Eleanor. Her Grace was the woman who had lived in this house for 30 years, and who occupied the morning room each day between 10 and noon, with her correspondence and her tea service, and her unshakable certainty that the order she maintained was the only order worth maintaining. Lady Phoebe visited every Tuesday and Thursday for tea, and Eleanor was not invited to attend. Eleanor was given the library. No one had told her she could use it, and no one had told her she could not. And on the 3rd morning of her marriage, she pushed open the heavy oak door and found a room that smelled of leather and dust and silence, and she sat in the window seat with her knees drawn up and her mother's book in her hands, and read for 2 hours, and felt, for the first time since the carriage, that she could breathe without measuring the breath. Sebastian found her there on the 5th morning. He stood in the doorway with a ledger under his arm, and regarded her with the expression of a man who has discovered an unexpected element in a familiar equation. His gaze moved from her face, to the book in her hands, to the window seat, where she had arranged the cushion and the light with the instinct of someone who understood rooms. "You read," he said. It was not a question. "I do, Your Grace." "Sebastian," he said. The correction was quiet, almost reluctant, as though he had not planned to offer it, and could not quite account for the fact that he had. She looked up from the page. His face gave nothing away, and his hand on the ledger was still. and the light from the window caught the edge of his jaw and held it. "Sebastian," she repeated, and the name in her mouth was a new weight, unfamiliar and warm, and his expression shifted by a degree so small that a less attentive woman would not have seen it. He nodded once and left. She sat in the window seat for a long time after, and her heart beat in her wrists, and she did not turn the page. The library became hers, not by decree, by occupation. She shelved the volumes that had been left in stacks. She aired the room on dry mornings, pushing the tall windows open and letting the October air move through the dust. She brought Cecily there on the afternoons when the nursemaid was occupied, and she read aloud from a book of fables while Cecily sat on the rug and turned the pages of an atlas she could not yet read, with a seriousness that made Eleanor's chest ache, and the room filled with the small domestic sounds of presence rather than absence. Mrs. Croft noticed. Mrs. Croft, who had served this house since before Sebastian's first marriage, who had laid out the table for his wedding to Catherine, and who had closed the curtains in the east bedchamber after Catherine died, looked at the library and its new order, and said nothing, and brought Eleanor tea without being asked. Sebastian passed the library door each evening on his way to the study. He did not always enter. Sometimes he paused, and Eleanor felt the weight of his attention through the wall, the way one feels a change in weather before the sky confirms it. And she turned a page and did not look up. And her body knew exactly where he was standing, and how long he stood there, and the precise moment when he moved on. The east bedchamber had been Catherine's. Eleanor learned this not from Sebastian, and not from the dowager, and not from any person who spoke to her with any frequency at all, but from a sampler that hung on the wall beside the window. Catherine Ashworth, 1808. Worked in blue thread on white linen, small and careful, and dated the year before she died. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the room on a Tuesday afternoon in late October and looked at the bed that had not been slept in, the dressing table that held a silver